Good morning, everyone. How's everyone doing?
Good.
Good? Well, I do see a lot of energy in the room, and we have very two energetic speakers today. I was just told good that I'm sitting here so that I don't get into crossfire. So I think I made a good risk decision. Okay.
Solid risk management.
Okay, so welcome to the session, Black Box to Own View of Risk. If you don't know me already, although I'm quite famous, I'm Shweta Gupta, CAT Risk and Modeling Advisor with NAIC's CAT Center of Excellence. And today I have the pleasure of introducing our two esteemed speakers, Mark Bowe and Kelly Heride. I hope I said it.
All right, you got it.
Right. We practiced. So first, a quick introduction for Mark. Well, both have impressive resumes. So first, Mark. So Mark is a meteorologist and he is Senior Vice President of NetCat Solutions for Munich Re America. Mark has been using his meteorological and climatological expertise to improve property cat underwriting for Munich Re Group for almost 25 years. Before Munich Re, Mark was a graduate research assistant at Florida State University in Tallahassee, and Mark's meteorological research on natural climate variability and its impact on extreme weather event was the 1998 recipient of the Father James P. McIlwain Award for Outstanding Undergraduate Research from the American Meteorological Society. So, thank you, Mark, for being here with us.
Thank you.
Next, we have Kelly. Kelly is the director of CAT R&D at Liberty Mutual in their corporate enterprise risk management group, and she has over 10 years of experience in CAT risk management across reinsurance and primary insurance companies. She specializes in climate change and emerging risk, and her team leads climate, physical, and transition risk analytics for Liberty Mutual. And Kelly has equally impressive bio as Mark. So Dr. Heride serves on the scientific advisory board for NOAA. She is a board member of International Society of Catastrophe Managers, ISCM, and then she also represents Liberty Mutual externally in variety of industry research forums, including Insurance Development Forum in Risk Modeling Steering Group and EOPA's Technical Expert Network on Catastrophe Risk. So we are very fortunate to have Kelly and Mark here with us today for this session. So in this session, we will discuss own view of risk. I hope you're kind of getting familiar with this term now. We talked about it in previous session on CAT and climate. So this is a framework that insurance and reinsurance companies, they use what I call to break free from the confines of so-called black box catastrophe models. So for first 20 minutes, we have Kelly and Mark have their presentation. So they will talk through that presentation, and then we'll go into a Q&A session, and we definitely would leave some time for audience Q&A. So welcome Kelly and Mark, and then Mark, you go first.
Sure. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending. It's a nice audience this morning. Again, I'm Mark Bowe. You heard my resume. Now it only makes me feel old to hear all that in 25 years with the Munich Re Group. But thank you for the kind words. And today we want to talk to you a little bit about how Munich Re looks at catastrophe risk models and how we look at adjusting it to meet our own internal view of risk. So when developing this presentation, we were asked to start right from the basics. So for those of you that are still just learning about catastrophe risk models or are new to the field, give a little bit of a definition here to start. So CAT models are just computer programs that estimate the financial impacts of a given peril to a single location or a full portfolio of risks and give you a lot of statistical output about pure premiums, how much the long-term costs would be to insure that risk over time for that peril, and of course the exceedance probability curves that tell you how likely it is for a loss event to exceed an X number of dollars. But these models use pre-compiled event sets, artificial events that look like they could actually occur in nature, that are used to calculate the financial losses to portfolios and contracts based upon the event intensity at each insured location of interest, the physical characteristics of the physical risk itself, and then of course the terms of the applicable insurance contracts. Now, of course, CAT models are just not released by vendors without looking and making sure that they're not complete garbage. They are trying to sell a product. I can get her to laugh so easily. So you can, no, because they are selling a commercial product, and if there is no value or skill to it, no one's going to buy it. So ultimately, the modelers spend a lot of time trying to calibrate their product before release to try to make sure that they best represent in the company's eye what their view of the risk is. However, many insurers and reinsurers do tend to opt and deviate from the default model output that the modelers recommend because they sometimes have more knowledge or additional knowledge or other views on how a model is built or different perils that would make us deviate and want to change a little bit from what the default model view is. And of course, we call this developing your own view of risk. Now, before I go any further, I want to reiterate, all models are wrong, some are useful. And that is true. You are never going to get an exact answer from any of these models, but some are useful. And doing an own view of risk process is an attempt by an organization to make the models even more useful for their own organization based upon the additional data they see that the vendor might not have or made different assumptions about. So as I said on the previous slide, these CAT models are commercial products. They are made to be sold for licensing fees and to make a profit for the company and its shareholders. But these models are built to appeal to as many customers as possible because that's what we want to do, as many versions of the software as you can. But the historical data that goes into these models can vary in its quality and quantity depending on the peril, the line of business, the construction or occupancy of the risk that you're concerned about. And finally, all these models, we don't have a full picture. For every hazard and peril, there are assumptions that the meteorologists and engineers, or seismologists as the case may be, at a modeling company to fill in the gaps. They have to make assumptions and approximations for things we don't really have a good answer for. And sometimes we can even deviate from there. And then additionally, models don't cover every line of business or peril that well. Aviation being one of them that's usually not heavily considered, and we need to make sure we address what these are quote-unquote white spots within the modeling as well, because we do cover aviation risks at Munich Re. So again, despite the modeling companies put in a tremendous amount of time and financial resource to try to get these models right, and they are making a full good faith effort, so I don't get any modelers in the room to throw tomatoes at me. They are trying to produce the best result they can for the industry. However, there are still plenty of cases where individuals or organizations might have a good objective, and I'm stressing here objective reason, to make a change from that black box view and develop an own view of risk. Ultimately, I want to say, though, is, ultimately, you have to see the forest from the trees. Ultimately, we are looking at the end result. And, there can be fudges in the hazard or the vulnerability we might not like, but if the results end up matching what we're seeing in reality with claims data and others, there are times and occasions we'll say, okay, because ultimately it's that end result and meeting and matching what we see in reality is the key. Sometimes if it's don't really overdo it and try to fix it. So as I've said, the own view of risk is to improve model financial output by working to achieve a better fit with hazard data and an end user's loss history. And I want to reiterate, as I bolded it in red on this screen, You should not go into an own view of risk process within your organization with a preconceived target or notion of where you want to end up. Then you're just gaming the system. We are trying to use objective data to see if we can do better than what the default black box out of the box is. So I can't just go up and say, the loss number at the 1,000-year PML should be X. That doesn't work. We need to have justification, data, and have peer review internally of every decision made to look at the model and its internal view of risk. So again, we resource at Munich Re, we resource publicly available data. We get client loss data from loss submissions, and we have their exposure data as well. So we're able to run and test on both internal portfolios and some of our client portfolios to see how it handles our client portfolios. And we have these oversights and controls throughout the process. So a known view of risk project does not the hazard module, the vulnerability, the financial module. You can alter and adjust what you want to do with an own view of risk based on the expertise within your own organization. Geoscientists like I, you do have some expertise. You can dig into some of the meteorological, climatological, or geological assumptions and make some changes there. But if you really don't have a lot of that expertise in-house, it becomes much more difficult to change there. Of course, for building vulnerability based on construction and occupancy, having engineering there, good work with your claims team on having good claims data to compare with historical loss events. And then, of course, the financial model requires teams of CAT modelers, underwriters, actuaries to make sure that the financial module is taking the net loss, the gross losses from the client, and processing them correctly throughout the entire financial contract or multiple contracts. So again, one view does not mean you have to adjust everything in your model. Some pieces you might find are perfectly good. And in many cases, we find where the vendor modelers have the most data tend to be the most reliable. Law of large numbers, the more data in, the more stable it gets. So, homeowners, single family dwelling, there's a lot of claims data. So there tends to be less issues with adjusting on a macro scale with that because there's a lot of data as compared to a more unique line like, a large high-rise skyscraper with a glass curtain wall. That has less data and there might be more reason, and if you insure those types of risks, more reason to deviate from what the model says based on your own data in-house. So as I said, myself, I am just one cog in the massive Munich Re organization, and none of this is done without extensive peer review across the organization. No single person can make a change to how we view our risk. It's an international collaborative process. And, our board of managements typically approve this, but it's these own view of risk projects are overseen by an internal accumulation risk committee. Usually the lead on the own view of risk project will coordinate with them, and the project lead will have his or her own core of about 5 to 6 people working on this project. And then you also have additional members of your organization feeding in data to that core project team, model outputs from given clients, et cetera. And then, of course, along the way, we have a more higher level sounding board that will take every month or every few weeks, you'll take a stop, talk about your progress, answer questions, and it's kind of another quality check and sanity check on what is being done and whether it makes sense. So overall, for any peril model, we are utilizing up to about 24 individuals across the Munich Re organization, and these projects do not happen quickly. They usually take at least 6 to 12 months to complete, and sometimes it takes us another year before we get to the point in our computer system cycle where we can incorporate changes into our underwriting systems. So what does our process look like? This is a very abridged version of what we do in-house. First, we have to decide which models and for which perils and regions we want to investigate. And then once we decide which models we want to investigate, we have to identify what kind of test portfolios we have, what kind of loss data that we have that we can use and test and calibrate the model. And sometimes this could be fictitious data, like putting in the same risk at every grid point within the model can give you a lot of useful information out. Particularly one example I'll show in a few minutes is Winfield of a stochastic event. But you will have normalized data, we'll have industry exposure databases as well. And usually where we start on these own view as risk is kind of on that large scale coarse tuning of the model, where we'll look at industry losses and industry level results from these models. But of course, we're not insuring the entire industry, not at that holistic level. So once we see coarse how the model's doing on a more coarse level, we kind of go more to the fine-tuning level by looking at individual clients that are key in the areas for the peril and region that we're looking at, and we will do multiple model runs with different views of risk that might fit different vulnerability options. And of course, we will compare this with our loss history and others and see if we agree, or if there is, our data are showing a slightly different solution than the vendor model actually is. So once we do all these test calculations, we have to decide which model we want to use and with what changes. And then, as I mentioned, there's a lot of white spots in these models, including marine, aviation, casualty, that need to be considered and are usually like little side projects within the own view of risk process. And then, of course, once we decide on a best practice, we have to model our full property reinsurance portfolio for the region in question. For the United States, that's over 200 U.S. insurance companies. So that's another big undertaking to rerun the entire portfolio with the updated best practice, and then ultimately gauge its effects on our capital model. And then, of course, when this is all said and done, the project lead still needs to write this up as documentation internally, a best practice guide for end users across the organization, and we also have to do a supplemental report showing all the data and decision making along the way that was done to justify the changes that we made. So that's a really large-scale overview of what you do. I want to give you, since I am an old now and I've been with the organization for 25 years, I want to give some very ancient history examples of things we've looked at in the past with different vendors and decided to deviate from them. So I want to give these are ancient, they're not in use or valid anymore within our organization. Otherwise, I would probably get the hook right now off the stage. But gives you an idea of the kinds of things that we're looking at. And really, the own view of risk really came into its own after the 04 and 05 hurricane seasons, where we had 7 major hurricanes make landfall along the coast. And of course, all the vendors needed to respond to that that very active 2 years, especially with the research going about the warm Atlantic oscillation, and we're in the warm phase and having more landfalls. So once the events of 04 and 05 happened, all the modelers responded because all their clients were asking, what the heck is going on? Can you give us a different view of the risk for periods where the Atlantic is warmer or colder? And all the vendor models responded and did that. But sometimes we see in models when they do an update, particularly responding to recent large events, sometimes they can overshoot and kind of overcorrect the situation in their model. And we felt that way with some of the corrections after 2005, looking at major hurricanes, categories 3, 4, and 5, which you can see on the right-hand side of the screen. Whoops, wrong. I guess I don't have a laser, my bad. So, but on the right hand, the bar charts, the green and reds are all the historical data about warm phases in the Atlantic and the rates of major hurricanes. But the black bar there is what the modeler decided was the new rate going forward post 2005, 2006. And it just, even though we know it's warmer, there's nothing in the historical record that can justify such a dramatic increase. So we pretty much decided we need to take some of the rate out of this because it's particularly overestimating in certain areas, and we don't think this is realistic. Again, we try to keep this as grounded as we can. We know things change, climate does change things, but we're not trying to cause shocks. We like to be a little more steady in our message, and it was just too much of an increase from the modelers, and we did not agree with it, and we took our own path and actually went into the rate the individual rates of events and altered them to reduce some of this severity from major hurricanes. Other things we look at, I mentioned, you can put a dummy exposure in every grid cell within a model, and you can get a lot of useful information out of it. This is one for the wind field for a given stochastic event. And this is another thing we look at. We look at tail end events. We manage to the 1 in 1,000 year return period event, so we end up looking at a lot of very extreme tail events. But even when we get there, some just don't look right to us. And, there could be arguments either way, but, this is showing a major Cat 5 landfall through New Orleans metropolitan area, then somehow around the Texas-Louisiana border re-intensifies into a Cat 4 and then takes out Dallas, Texas. So we saw this is an extreme case, but we saw in many cases that the inland filling rate, particularly with these very extreme storms, was unrealistic. So again, we decide to reduce their impact within the event set to reduce their ultimate impact on the modeling of tropical cyclone for us. Now, you might want to ask, getting away from the hazard module itself, like I said, we use a lot of client claims data to try to validate what the models are telling us and to see if the models are consistently over or underestimating the actual client loss from certain events. So you can see each of these boxes that you see on the plot are historical losses, and the size of the boxes are partially dictated by the severity of the event. Katrina is the big burgundy box in the upper right, but all those boxes have uncertainty because there's been time since the event. Your portfolio that you're modeling changes. So there is uncertainty in that axis, and then there's also uncertainty, if it happened again today, what the losses are. So that's why you see these box plots, because we have to consider the uncertainty around what would it be like if it happened again today. And you can see the solid line diagonal, that's the 1-to-1 line. If everything's sitting on that line, that tells you, for this client at least, the model is performing pretty much on target where you'd want it to be. But notice in this example, a lot of the boxes lie to the left and above the 1-to-1 line, which tells us that in this case, for this client, the model is in general overestimating the losses than they actually experience. And this means that when we look at this portfolio, we know that it's underrepresenting. Maybe there needs to be a talk with the client, make them understand what we're seeing, and say, this might need to warrant a little bit more premium because the models are underrepresenting the risk there. Now, for large scale hazards like hurricane, like earthquake, there's a lot you can do with the internal tables of the model to adjust and fiddle the results. But for other peril models, particularly the non-secondary perils, as call them, like convective storm, you can't really look and alter individual events because these SCS events are not a single contiguous area that's impacted, like with hurricane or earthquake. You have hundreds or thousands of discontinuous discrete events. So if you try to calibrate an SCS model with changing event rates or others in one region, you're going to inadvertently affect dozens of other regions. And it just becomes a complicated mess, and trust me, don't mess with it. Nothing good will come of it. So what you do is instead you look at the loss curves and look at your loss history, whether industry or client, and make some adjustments. And here's an example. The green line is empirical EP curve for the Ozarks for 98 through 2019. I will note that the highest 2 points on the green curve, we don't have enough data to know what their true return period is, but we can see that we tend to know that these models don't account for everything that happens in a loss event. So we usually see if the curves are slightly above the historical EP curve, and then of course we try to do a counterbalance. If we see larger losses, even if we don't know the return period, we might adjust slightly here. And for this region, I picked the Ozarks region we use because we're in Missouri. We did a slight increase, but also this was really calibrated for the frequency space, which is a lot of what SCS is. For the tail, our primary insurance operations will actually do two adjustments to these curves, one for the frequency space and one for the severity space, because it's really hard to just do a single factor with what these actual loss curves look like in history to get it to match to modeling. So we actually get that sophisticated, and depending on where you are in the curve, we are looking at other areas. And as I mentioned, the less data, the less frequency of a hazard in a given area, the harder it is to model, and the more likely there is a chance you want to deviate from what the modelers are saying. And here's one fun example from about 15 or so years ago, is in 2010, the city of Phoenix, Arizona suffered its worst hail loss in history, about $2.75 billion. When we looked at the models, there wasn't a $2.5 billion event for Arizona for hail in any of these models. So when the vendor went and adjusted, because they saw this event have to adjust, you can see what happened. Arizona went from the dark blue curve towards the third from the bottom to the light blue curve at top. So in some ways, they overreacted to the $2.5 billion event. But also, that event in Phoenix had us thinking, it's like, what other major cities in the Southwest that are impacted by the monsoon that can get large thunderstorms and hail events, where else could a Phoenix-like event happen in that region? And the obvious answer is Las Vegas, Nevada. It is not that different topologically. It's a little further inland. But again, Las Vegas is a town of glass curtain walls that are extremely vulnerable to hail, all the casino and hotels. So we looked at that, and instead, the Nevada curve went from the second to above, and they actually dropped it. It's like, this makes no sense to us. They're not that far from each other. The risk is fairly consistent with the monsoon thunderstorms, and yet they dropped it. So we actually counterbalanced both of these. We lowered the Arizona a bit because it was overreaction, and we actually, only for Clark County in Nevada, we actually said you want to increase it because if you are insuring those glass curtain walls on those casinos, this is showing it's way too low. So this was just a broad, hopefully this gave you an insight of how my organization looks into working with and developing, and some actual concrete examples of what we've done in the past. And I think Kelly now is going to take it and show you some more different ideas and conceptual ideas of what you do around own view of risk. And I look forward to the Q&A in a few minutes.
Well, thanks, Mark. And, he gave us a great overview of why and how you would develop your own view of risk. And now I'm going to start talking about what are the pieces or the components of a view of risk. Because, even though, Mark, you just told us that a view of risk is full of objective information, and it is. But a view of risk is also a statement of a company's values. It is where you have chosen to invest your scientific resources, your engineering resources, your technological resources to say, this is what I consider important to my company, and this is the level of tolerance for risk that I have within my organization. So the pieces that I'm going to talk about that go into a view of risk today are the inputs to a model, understanding how mature the model is that you're working for, and then identifying pieces that are missing within the model ecosystem that you would add. So the first thing is making sure that when you are running a model, you have things in that make sense, that your inputs are cleaned out. So this is, on the left, you see a flood map. So it's essentially a flood hazard map of the city of Houston. And you'll notice that it looks like essentially a street grid because it is. And in the city of Houston, as in many other places, your streets essentially behave as your flood defenses of last resort, meaning they are lower in topography than the surrounding buildings, so they tend to be the thing that floods first. So if you are inputting data into a catastrophe model, you have to understand at the level of an individual parcel where your building actually sits. So sure enough, in the picture on the right, you can see the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey, and you can see every one of those streets is underwater and the houses are generally dry. So a typical geocoder that's used to determine where your buildings are located to start running a catastrophe model are often based on things like postal delivery information. They put the dot on the mailbox. So if you'll notice, there are these series of little black dots in the middle of that flooded street in Houston. Every one of those mailboxes is underwater. Every one of those homes is dry. So part of our view of risk is investing in collecting spatial information about our actual location. So it's not, we haven't even gotten to the model itself, but collecting information about that input data is itself a view of risk. Similarly, we've found in the aftermath, one of the things that we learn from events is that there are certain sort of secondary characteristics that are enormously important to collect, and others that maybe change things a few percent but don't make a big difference. So this is a picture from the aftermath of Hurricane Ian with Punta Gorda. And although, as you can see as this video is going by, that the trees are looking like they're in pretty bad shape, this area went through the eye wall of a Category 4 hurricane. And what you'll notice on all of those buildings there are these metal hip roofs. Collecting information about roofs is one of the most important pieces of information we can collect for all of our wind perils. Without the strength of the Florida building codes, those roofs would have been lost. And when I see a missing roof as an insurer in the aftermath of a disaster, I know that that home is probably essentially a total loss. So that critical piece of information, that information about the roof, tells us where we need to focus on collecting secondary information that will materially affect how those losses are reflected in our models. So now I want to talk about sort of the maturity of the modeling ecosystem. So we don't just apply adjustments to models sort of blindly and treating all of those models equally, because some models have been under development for decades and others are relatively new, and so you can't treat them all like they're producing the same type of information. So for example, for hurricane, which has essentially been around for 30 years, it's been very much battle tested, and it's not to say that those models are perfect, but there's been a lot of investment into getting that information right. So that's an area where we feel confident in doing more sophisticated risk adjustments. So for example, a project that our team recently ran was to adjust hurricane rates, where we partnered with an outside academic who does a lot of the hurricane seasonal forecasting. Poor Phil, he's been having a bad couple of months, but this outside academic researcher has been able to help us think about re-examining our historical data. And importantly, that means not just, say, taking our history as it is, but thinking through how outside factors like climate change may be interpreting or changing our interpretation of that historical record. So we feel confident in reassessing this historical record in the context of a changed climate to recommend an updated event frequency going forward. Sort of kind of in the middle here are these medium maturity models, where wildfire is a great example of a medium maturity model, where we have probabilistic tools and we have probabilistic CAT models, but they're relatively newer. We have an ecosystem that's changing really rapidly, again, with climate change. And so part of our view of risk is not just adjusting the catastrophe model, but actually supplementing it with additional external tools. So this video is from the Marshall Fire in Colorado. It was the most destructive wildfire in Colorado history. And this is what it looks like when you put 100-mile-an-hour wind gusts on what is essentially a grass fire. I mean, this was not burning what would have shown up as a high-risk area in a catastrophe model. It was burning Costco parking lots. So that says something about how our risk environment is changing, and in particular, how it's changing with a changing environment. So the map that you see up there on the top right, I got to do my left right here, up on the top right is an example of where we have mapped out areas that we think are susceptible to wind-driven wildfire risks in black. But importantly, we also have done sensitivity testing to look for changes in our marginal risk as temperatures are changing. So with an increase in temperature, this is an example of a 3°C temperature change, we're looking for areas that perhaps are at lower risk today, but who we expect to see increasing risk in the future. So we can use these external supplements to inform our portfolio management strategy and not just plan for the risk that exists today, but also plan how we can grow and distribute our exposures going forward into the future. So the last bucket are what we call low maturity models. These are relatively new models. Things like cyber risk are a great example, where we don't consider them sufficient on their own as standalone tools. And so we, again, bring in additional models and then supplement them with deterministic scenarios, because there it gets really important to not just run the model as it is, but put in place controls on your accumulations to make sure that you don't get caught out if that model is wrong. So we expect for immature models that volatility is going to be an important part of the story. So this is an example where 3 different that, each one of them this is just from one model version to the next. And we see models that are changing from one version to another at the 40 and 50% range. So if we were to set a risk tolerance based on where the model is today, and then said, oh, well, I'm going to make a 2% loss adjustment to this model, and then an update comes out and there's a 50% change in the risk, are we really doing anything valuable or useful there? So instead, we add in these model blending approaches that can help us smooth out this version-to-version volatility while still allowing for that hazard to evolve, because of course cyber hazard is evolving really rapidly. And then we supplement this with external views of just our broader accumulation based on things like sectoral analyses. So I think what I want you to take away from this is that the overall view of risk, the catastrophe model itself is only one piece of that view of risk ecosystem of the input data, the model itself, and then other controls and risk management practices that all wrap around that model view of risk. And of course, the good news or the bad news is that this view of risk job is never done. For those of you who are not very online, this is the aftermath of Hurricane Beryl. Hurricane Beryl caused something like 2 million power outages. And this is an area that we've identified in our modeling ecosystem that critical infrastructure failures behave as a risk multiplier. You can take any loss, and if you have, say, weeks of power outages afterwards, it's enhancing your business interruption, it's causing a lot of disruption. So the power provider in Houston actually couldn't figure out how to track where power outages were happening. And so this was a picture from social media where people were using their Whataburger app. So for those of you who aren't from Texas, Whataburger is the greatest burger in America. They were using which restaurants are open to be able to identify which neighborhoods had power and which ones did not. So using these creative sources of new data can allow us to learn from every event as it happens. And we will always have surprises. There will always be new things. And to me, that's what makes the job interesting, and it means that our work is never done. And now I'd be happy to take questions. See, I got another Whataburger lover back there. You and me, we're here for it.
So we have time for Q&A from audience. So be brave.
Hi, Kelly. George Bradner, Connecticut. I always love listening to you talk. You always bring a lot of great information to the table. I really liked, if you go back to the slide where you were showing, or really where you talked more about being able to identify future risk development. The first thing I started thinking about that slide was, you guys have this amazing information, and how can that be conveyed to communities so that communities can begin planning? And I'm sitting here with Commissioner Trinidad and Navarro, and we were talking about, the pros and cons of that. Do you suddenly get beaten up because you're creating scare tactics? And, it's just like the whole communication of this is so important and delicate at the same time. But to me, whether it's wind or whether it's fire, you guys have extremely important information that show people risk. And if you do nothing, your rates are going to go up exponentially, even higher. And if you start doing something now, you can help offset and, and maybe, minimize the overall impact of a rate that's going to impact your community. So I think this is important information about how insurers can be part of the solution. And, I like the information. So there's, let me know what you think.
You want to repeat that?
Sure, I'll repeat the question.
Do you have it on? There you go.
I think now the mic is on. It's basically, the essence of the question is just looking at the map that insurers have a lot of risk information, that can be useful for community planning in terms of thinking about the future risk, then how can insurers be part of this ecosystem when it comes to the communication piece?
So this is an area that I feel very strongly and passionately about, as anyone who's ever had a cocktail with me would be able to tell you, which is that insurance is a really important part of the story on climate adaptation. We have pieces of information that tell you about risk to communities, and those communities need that information to be able to plan. The dilemma that we're running into is that you can't, if you're going into a community with new information, if you hand them new information without also handing them a plan for how to do that second part that you talked about, the adaptation, the risk mitigation, that wraparound service of what do you do next, what you've done is people who made a decision to buy a home or to start a business with the best information that was available at the time now are in a position where they're concerned that their property values might decrease, that their community might not be supported in the future. So so the easy answer is just give out information, and we have to get there, but we can't do that in isolation. Information alone is not sufficient. You also need a plan. So, we're already seeing impacts on things like real estate markets as there has been a massive ecosystem of other sort of climate data analytics providers springing up in the space. Some of them have good information and some of them are a little rough. Insurers need to be a part of that story. We are the best, not to toot our own horns, on the planet at figuring out risks of extreme events to the built environment, and we have not been present in the way that we should have been. So all of that is to say that information needs to be more transparent. There needs to be more academic research doing this. The insurance industry needs to be more transparent, but it's not a simple handover information because there are consequences to that. The state of Oregon actually tried to produce new wildfire risk maps. Some of you may have heard, what was it, a year or two ago, and they had to withdraw them because they put those maps out and the community pushed back saying, you have affected my home's property value because of what you did. And they were furious. And they ended up pulling the product back under extreme duress. So we can't just operate with data in a vacuum. More data, we always say more data is a good thing. But that needs to be occurring within sort of a broader sort of sociological investment in climate adaptation.
So I have a question over here. Thank you very much, both of you. Great presentations. But the way I viewed what you presented was sort of, hey, here's a model output. Here's how we supplement that, adjust that. Another strategy could be, here's one model output. Here's another model output. Here's another model output, right? Instead of these own internal. So could you talk about how you use multiple models in terms of then complementing that or supplementing that with your own views of risk?
I can start with that. And the question is how do you work with own view of risk across multiple models and account for that? Munich Re, we really do not have multiple models for most perils in the United States. We are a one model shop, and we take the opinion that it's better to know one model inside and out, especially with our long-term relationship with our vendor. We do get quite a bit of access. We can ask questions to the model developers. We'd rather know it inside and out and work towards that, putting our own view of risk. Now, you don't need a separate vendor to get another view of risk out of a model anymore. In the old days before Katrina, it was a black box. There were very few knobs and levers that you can change. But, you can argue that even without going to multiple vendors, you can look at different views and sensitivity outputs from one model and decide how that looks compared to your data. But ultimately, it would be the same process across multiple models. It just ends up you're doubling a lot of the work you have to do, or tripling, to compare and to do the prep work for multiple models. And then you need to decide which ones are the best assumptions, which ones are matching your clientele, and it might not. You might find some clients, some vendors in some geographies do better than one model, and vice versa in other places. So it's never really cut and dry. What we do try to avoid, though, is trying to blend models, because really, in some respects, you're just blending and averaging 2 or 3 wrong answers to get another wrong answer. So, you have to still take things with a grain of salt. It's fine. You can look across and decide what fits your portfolio and your data best. But there you can do this in a one model framework as well. There's enough knobs and levers today. But ultimately, we don't really necessarily agree on the averaging or blending, because you just get another wrong answer.
Agreed. You do get another wrong answer. Sometimes that damping of volatility can be worth that wrong answer. But again, that's where you have to make choices, again, depending on the maturity of your modeling ecosystem, what do you think is the skill across the market? And that may differ by peril and by geography too. So historically, the industry has done a lot of what you've been discussing, like, well, I'm going to buy 2 U.S. hurricane models, I'm going to blend them together 50-50, and is that really meaningful? So I think now the catastrophe modeling world has made more deliberate choices of, sometimes we want to lean on one model, sometimes we need to fill gaps with alternative modeling ecosystems, sometimes you're using multiple views, sometimes you use a model and you supplement it with outside deterministic scenarios. I think those are all choices of risk management that sometimes multiple models can be part of the answer, but it's one of sort of a menu of potential options that can give you a variety of ways to approach every different risk, because every risk is really different.
Yeah, each model provides a solution. You just need to determine which one is closest to the ground truth that you have. As Kelly said, garbage in, garbage out with exposure. If you're not putting in the right exposure, everything else that follows is going to be suspect as well. Brace yourself. You asked him a question yesterday.
I know. I asked mean questions in other people's sessions, and now it's my turn. Nice questions. Nice questions. I asked you a nice question.
So, all the modeling that you're talking about is generally private sector modeling. And so we're continuing to hear more and more about the possibility at the federal level of there being a public model. We've now, as of this morning, there was an article talking about California that's talking about, a wildfire model on the public side. If the states and at the federal level, they start developing their own CAT models, how do you think from your positions, how are you guys going to, will you acknowledge it? Will you use it? Will you tell them to stop it? I mean, what's your read on that type of investment?
That is a mean question.
That is. Do you want to start? I'll follow up.
I'll start. I'm delighted that more people are building catastrophe models. I would prefer that they build good ones, and that is still an open question. But I read this, a few years ago, I read this really interesting research study that they used dummy models. Like they weren't real, but all they did was they simulated diversity of model views. They simulated what happens if everybody agrees on one model to an insurance market over time versus if there are 3 or 4 or 5 models. None of them agree, but they represent a range of opinions about what can happen. And they did this sort of like agent-based model that said, what happens to the insurance companies in each of these situations? And what they found was that when you have a wider range of potential views out on the market, individual companies would get into trouble if they happened to pick the model that was wrong in any situation. But what you don't have is the one model is wrong, and then everybody goes down together. Diversification doesn't just work within an insurance portfolio, it works across the insurance ecosystem. So I say the more the merrier. Let's build them. Some are going to be good, some are going to be crap, and part of our job is to get in there and break them and make sure they're any good.
Yeah, I, in general, agree with Kelly. I would take the story of the Florida hurricane model as a cautionary tale. For those not familiar with the story, when the Florida Commission for Hurricane Loss Projection Methodology was created, they saw the 1,000-year return period. Some people in the commission said, we don't believe these numbers, we'll build our own model. They ended up building their own residential personal lines model for the state of Florida, and the 100-year loss was larger than any other of the private vendor models. So, they kind of disprove that, they ended up with the opposite result of kind of what they expected. So again, it is quality, it's put in, if the federal government does this, let's make sure we have the resources to do it right. Once again, it is all down to model quality, and in many respects, it's good to have a public model that you can at least test and almost create a common ground by which people can share. It used to be that EDMs or exposure data is the currency of our industry. But also we kind of need baseline tools as well that we can at least have a baseline that we can compare to each other without using private vendors, so we can understand little tweaks in there. So yeah, I don't think getting another answer out there is wrong. It's again, getting it right and knowing how to fit it into your own internal ecosystem.
But if it sucks, we're going to break it.
Oh yeah, well, that's our job. We kind of break all these and try to see what goes wrong.
But it gets back to the very first question is how do you convey information out to communities, and having more publicly available information so that communities can make good choices is important, right? There is this massive body of information on how investments in risk reduction, on how decisions that are made in the built environment, how we zone, how we build, where we can run experiments with catastrophe models that tell us, here is the dollar cost of this decision that you are making right now and in the future. And that is not available in the public today. That would be enormously informative for the uncomfortable climate adaptation decisions that are coming, and it's not there. So bring the academics on, bring the public sector on. I want to have that debate out in the open so that we can make those choices as a society with real transparency.
So, and Kelly, we are trying to also do that within the CAT COE, right? The research and leveraging the vendor models to do that for the DOIs. One quick comment and a question for Mark, but Mark, just in defense of the public model in Florida, they are an approved model from the Florida Hurricane Commission, right? So they have gone through that process as the other model vendors have. Maybe initially it was, so we can take that offline.
I was not commenting on whether it was approved or not. It was just, they
I
had an
gotcha.
unexpected initial outcome from it.
I gotcha. So my question though to you is on, you mentioned claims a number of times. Where do you think claims data is compared to where it needs to be? And do you see sort of a role for insurance regulators in getting companies to have better claims data available?
Oh, I love this question. Oh, I love this
guys are
question. Claims data, especially at the reinsurer where you're getting claims data from 200 different clients with different servers and processes. First of all, we typically do not get the full claims history at the individual level. We usually get the aggregated loss history or bordereaux over time. But that being said, when we look at raw data, even within our own primary operations, is like sometimes it's very hard to determine what actually was the cause of loss. Was it, they'll say like wind and water, and it's hard to parse which is which. So, I would say overall, there is a need for, I know it's hard across different organizations, more consistency in how claims are accounted for, reported, and then, and also compartmentalized by hazard itself. And this becomes particularly hard in like coastal areas where you have the mix of storm surge and wind loss. And usually all that's reported is one number and you don't know which is which. And this makes it more difficult for calibrating both the wind and surge pieces of a model. So I see a lot. We're starting to use AI to pick out certain things within claims data. But again, everyone does it differently, and it's hard even within our own organization to pick out the different hazards embedded within. So if I had one wish, it would be like clear, this was the wind piece that we adjusted, this is the water piece, or whatever other hazard that needs to be included.
So I think we are almost out of time, but thank you to our panel, Kelly and Mark, and audience question. I didn't have to ask my seat questions.
You had so many. We're so good, guys. Her questions were really good.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.